talking about New York. We're north of the Mason-Dixon line for good for the rest of this meeting. Although we hope our southern participants will still help us out with some stuff and answer some of the questions that they do come up. And our next speaker is Chris Miller. He's the manager at the USDA, and Natural Resources Conservation Service Plant Materials Lab. And we've been talking about living shorelines, and obviously one of the living component is the plants. That's something we haven't focused on. So we have Chris is going to talk a little bit about what we should be looking for as we get further north, and what will perhaps work in New York. So, Chris?
All right, thank you. So
this is the pointer.
That's the pointer. All right. Okay, I seem to always have the unenviable task of speaking right after lunch. So I'm always under pressure to make sure I try to keep everyone awake and try to be interesting enough that folks will listen. So I'm going to try to do that today once again. Also, to put things in perspective a little bit, I'm a plant and soil specialist. That's my background. I'm not a coastal processing specialist. I'm not a coastal engineer, but I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so that probably helps a little bit. But
you did.
I did. Yes, I'm not kidding. I did. But anyway, I am going to focus on my experiences in the practical side of recommending plants, not only for tidal shorelines, but dunes. I'm going to focus on tidal shorelines today, obviously. But on dunes, we work in what we call critical areas that are disturbed, either man-made or natural, mine sites. So I've worked in the stream bank arena. So basically anywhere that erosion is occurring, whether it's natural or man-made, I've been involved in the last 24 years making planting recommendations for those types of sites. And obviously, most of my experience is on-the-job training and just from learning through experience, learning from failures. We often learn the most from our failures. Just kind of want to give you a little bit of perspective on some of the things I've seen in the tidal shoreline arena, and maybe some tips, hopefully, on using plants in that environment. And how do I advance here? Just
the buttons on either side of that red button. Or you can just press it.
Oh, okay. Just to give you a little background on the facility. As Jay mentioned, we're moving a little bit closer to Long Island now. We're in southern New Jersey. I work at a plant research facility. It's the Cape May Plant Materials Center. It's operated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, you can imagine, since we're funded by the Agriculture Department, we have to do we have to please a lot of people. We have to work in the arena of agriculture for cover crops. We do windbreak studies. We've done water quality studies, in addition to working in the coastal arena, which was our original legislative mandate back in the mid-1960s. We were established as a result of, or in response to, the 1962 nor'easter, which was mentioned earlier by a number of speakers. There was an interest at the time to get a facility established that would test and select plants for the coastal environment, and to make those plants available to the commercial nursery industry for propagation for projects. I've had to explain what our role is after Hurricane Sandy, because we've been getting calls from landscapers, contractors. I need 1.5 million beach grass. I need 500,000 cordgrass. And I need to explain to them that our role in this whole scheme of things in the plant realm is to provide plant materials to the nursery industry, who then will propagate the plants and make those available for project sites. Unfortunately, the demand was so high after the storm that even the commercial nursery industry could not supply the demand of some of the plant materials, primarily beach grass and others. But what we're going to be working in the future, if we survive the USDA cuts, we're going to be working in the future to try to make those materials more available for projects. Just one more thing about our facility. We're an 88-acre facility. We're right just west of the Garden State Parkway in southern New Jersey. There's tidal marsh right on the other side. So we're very close to the dunes of Avalon and Stone Harbor and Cape May. We're very close to tidal estuaries. We have a lot of areas where we do testing and plant evaluation. It's close by. And that was one of the reasons why we were selected for that location. Our service area is actually Cape Cod, Massachusetts, down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So we have a 9-state service area. By that we mean we make collections, we provide technical assistance, we provide nursery materials or provide breeder or foundation materials to nurseries within that 9-state service area of Massachusetts and North Carolina. We're centrally located in southern New Jersey, and that was on purpose. One of the things I've learned about when going out and looking at sites, and all morning long you've heard from the speakers talking about their experiences with projects, so I'm not going to dwell on this very much, but there was I believe it was Army Corps that came out with this table in some of their early, one of their early publications in the 1970s from the Waterways Experiment Station, or may have been the Coastal Engineering Fort Belvoir Station, that came out with a table called Vegetative Treatment Potential. And I don't have a picture of the table, but you could find it in the literature. And it basically gave you some guidance if you go out and look at a particular site. And I'm sure, Scott, you're familiar with that, right? The vegetative treatment potential. Maybe you were involved in helping develop that. Basically, going out and evaluating a site and looking at some different parameters, like what kind of sand supply do you have? What's the orientation or shape of the beach? What's the fetch distance across that waterway that you're looking at? Whether there's boat wake or not? How wide the existing beach is? Whether you have vegetation on either side of your potential project site, and you rank all those things by numbers, and then you come up with basically an index value that indicates whether that site is suitable for planting or not, or whether it's fair, or poor, or good, or excellent, based on a lot of these different parameters I've mentioned here. Now that's only looking at it strictly from a vegetative planting aspect. That's not incorporating any engineering into that site, not incorporating sills, not incorporating any type of structural measure. It's only going out and looking at whether the site's suitable for planting. But it's a good start. So I'm sorry I don't have that particular reference located here, but it's called Vegetative Treatment Potential. It's an Army Corps generated guidance. Yes, Laura? You'll see it in the next presentation, yes. Next year, right? Whatever. The one after the next, okay, whatever. Anyway, so I mean, this happens to be a shoreline site. It's a relatively sheltered area. Notice this is the quote-unquote degraded condition, meaning that it's not all that bad. I mean, there was an old ramp here, bulkhead or something. Some old timbers there that may have been washed out by a storm or two. But I mean, generally, it's not that bad as far as the erodibility. But we just decided to go in and enhance it. And of course, the site was very conducive to planting alterniflora right here in the intertidal zone, and then Peyton's just above mean high tide. And then there's some baccharis here and some other trees in this particular site. So this had all those parameters that are good for establishing plant materials on a shoreline site. Now here's the opposite side. Now this isn't very far from that previous slide. I think the previous slide was down in here somewhere. This is actually the Toms River, which drains into the Barnegat Bay, which is in central Jersey, Ocean County, New Jersey, which was the area was basically hammered by Hurricane Sandy. There's still an estimated 30 homes in the bay that they're continuing to excavate. Untold numbers of boats, vehicles. I mean, basically, Barnegat Bay is a dump site right now that they're trying to clean up. But anyway, this is just upriver in the Toms River area. But this has a lot of site constraints. First of all, it has a 3 to 4 mile fetch to the northeast, so we get the nor'easter storms. It's a straight shoreline. It has a lot of heavy boat traffic, and the substrate is actually a gravel, not a sand that moves. It doesn't have any sand supply. But we were doing an evaluation, shoreline erosion evaluation with the Ocean Soil Conservation District, and we decided that we would try to do something here to see if we could get vegetation established. So we use these, I don't know if anybody's producing these right now in the nursery industry, but they're called bog mats. They're about a 2-inch thick coir fiber, coconut fiber mat that can be pre-planted. This was done by Pinelands Nursery in Columbus, New Jersey. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that nursery, a big wetland plant supplier. Planted with Spartina alterniflora. The roots kind of get entwined into this biomat material. Then you roll the material up, and you take it out to your site, and you unroll it, and you stake it down, and you cross your fingers and you hope for the best. Well, this is a pretty high wave energy site, so we decided to do something like this rather than just go out and put in plugs. Well, look, 1 year later, look at what the site looks like. Obviously, those bog masses had become established. It's like I said, it's a very gravelly site. The wave energies are high, so even going out with something that would be considered sort of a soil bioengineering approach, or using a combination of plants with some structural or organic material to help, keep those plants in place, didn't work because of all these various site constraints. Now, something else that is interesting to note. Well, we also used a biolog in front of it, which again blew out that first winter. The biologs are only as strong as the netting, and once the netting becomes degraded, starts to break, basically the coir fiber materials in that log just kind of blow apart. But notice here, there's no alterniflora growing naturally in this intertidal area here. But there was some curbing placed right here in one section of this shoreline, which is only, about 6 inches high or so? And there was a nice stand of patens, Spartina patens, just behind that curbing. All you really needed was 6 inches of protection there, and you had a pretty decent stand of vegetation naturally. It wasn't planted, it was natural. I mean, it may have been planted a long, long time ago, but it was occurring in there. And then you had a slope that went up, right here's the slope. This looks kind of flat, it's actually a slope, to a park. And the problem was that folks were accessing the water from the park, were walking down this slope, and they were eroding the slope. So as part of this project, we also combined some plants, some woody and herbaceous plants to stabilize the slope. But it was interesting to note that just 6 inches of elevation here, 6 inches of protection allowed for vegetation behind there. The site did not support alterniflora, Spartina alterniflora, in front of that. And I think sometimes we just need to sort of evaluate, is it necessary to have the alterniflora there? Maybe not. If you could somehow engineer something here to just be able to stabilize it behind that protection, and then to stabilize the slope, that's the best we were able to do without extensive cost, without extensive engineering. And so it's interesting to note that alterniflora does not occur anywhere along this whole stretch, just because of these site constraints. So you would need something like this, some sort of a sill or revetment of some kind or whatever, to protect that site and to allow the alterniflora to flourish behind it. So is it necessary to go to that extreme cost and extent on all the sites we look at? Maybe we just have to, again, start at that mean high water and work our way back. So as far as selecting the species you're going to use, I mean, you've heard the main ones, the main species that are used is alterniflora and Spartina patens. There's some other species that can be incorporated, which I'll mention in a minute. Of course, the zonation is very important in these tidal shoreline sites. The salt concentration of the water you're dealing with is very important to help select your proper species. And generally, I think another speaker this morning talked about shading. Shading is very detrimental to these shoreline species. You need at least 6 to 8 hours, a minimum of 6, and maybe even as much as 8 hours of direct sunlight during the course of the growing season for the Spartina and most of the shoreline species to flourish. You want to plant, at low tide, you want to plant in as dry condition as possible. The general recommendations are 1 to 2 foot centers, depending on the severity of the site. You're going to plant alterniflora from mean tide to mean high tide, and then above that, you're going to have patens and some other materials. This is in a high salt environment. Someone talked about the Osmocote slow-release fertilizer being very effective. Again, you're putting it in the planting hole. It's released over a period of 3 to 4 months. It's granular, or it's pelletized actually, and it seems to really give the plants a good head start on stabilizing. And then usually in high salt concentration planting sites, it's recommended that whoever's supplying the material to acclimate the plants to the higher salt environment. And that's particularly if you're going to be going into like a 25 or 28 or 30 parts per thousand environment, or seawater's 35, just to give you a perspective. So if you're from like the low to mid 20s up to the low to mid 30s, it's advisable to have the supplier acclimate those plants to that particular salinity. The way that's done is, the way we acclimate our plants at the Plant Materials Center, we start at 5, and then we raise it every 2 parts per thousand, like every other day, until we get up to whatever level the water is where we're going to be planting the plants. As far as planting time, I wanted to mention a few things about planting time. It's all about reducing risk. You can pretty much plant just about any time of the year, but you're assuming more risk at certain times of the year than other times of the year. Now, primarily for herbaceous materials, we find that the optimum planting window is April to June. The exception would be that if you're going to be planting beach grass. The beach grass, if you have a sandy beach or a sandy area that you want to stabilize with beach grass or have beach grass as a component, that usually needs to get in before May, usually by like mid-April, because the plants need to be dormant. They don't transplant very well as a bare root plant dug from the field when they're actively growing. So and the commercial growers of beach grass realize this, and so they harvest their material when it's dormant before it starts actively growing for the season, and then they supply it to projects when it's dormant. If you wait too long and you wait to harvest it until after it's growing, and then harvest it from the field and then separate the stems become very soft and they don't transplant as well. So most of your suppliers are well aware of the planting window for beach grass. The other materials, whether they're bare root, field dug, or whether they're plugs or containerized material, can be planted later than, say, mid-April, and you can almost go into like late June. We've observed on working with the Army Corps of Engineers in Jamaica Bay with some of their planting windows that if you start putting tidal marsh plants in around July, they just don't put enough growth on until they go dormant in the fall. And then they're more susceptible to being eroded out or popped out, freeze-thaw cycles. They're more susceptible to being plucked by waterfowl. So we've pretty much made the recommendation that the plants need to get in certainly before the end of June. Now, for some larger trees or shrubs, if you're using larger containers or balled and burlap or something like that, or doing a plant salvage of some kind, fall is an option also for the woody materials. But for herbaceous materials, it's April to June. Now, I've had questions from people. Can I plant my Spartina in September, October? Well, again, if it's a really protected site, if there's not a lot of wave energy, if you want to assume a little bit of a risk, you can certainly plant then. But again, you're not going to get a whole lot of root growth. You're not going to get those roots extending out, and the water's still kind of warm then. You might get a little bit of root growth, but you may not get enough until winter sets in, and then the plants are somewhat susceptible again to being taken out by waves or freeze-thaw or things like that through the winter. So that's why fall isn't really an optimum time for planting the shorelines either. This just gives you some of the more common species and what their tolerances are as far as salt goes in parts per thousand. Obviously your alterniflora, your patens, and your disticulus are very highly salt tolerant. Your Spartina pectinata, Spartina sinusoides, so that's freshwater cordgrass and giant cordgrass, have a much lower tolerance to salt, as well as the American three-square and the blackgrass, the Juncus gerardi, has a little bit higher salt than the Spartina sinusoides and pectinata. And then, that might be hard to see down at the bottom there, I have switchgrass and coastal panic grass. Can tolerate some higher levels of salt. But generally they're not planted in the water environment, so they're basically tolerant to salt spray and occasional overwash by storm tide. So obviously, the zonation with patens and or alterniflora and patens, it's alterniflora in the intertidal. Above mean high tide is patens. You can incorporate beach grass up above mean high tide also. You can incorporate switchgrass, coastal panic grass. We don't have to just stick with alterniflora and patens, especially if you're dealing with slopes. We have a release. By a release, I mean that we've made this genetic material available to growers called Avalon. It originated from Avalon, New Jersey, so it's relatively local material. We released it to the commercial marketplace back in the 80s, I believe. It's grown by probably a half dozen, maybe 8 growers in the Northeast. But one of its claims to fame is that it's also good as a dune stabilizer. So you think of Peyton's as being a marsh plant, which yes, it is, but someone made a comment earlier that it doesn't like wet feet continuously like the alterniflora does. That's true, it doesn't. But people don't think about using it in dry sands, and it actually spreads very well and grows very well in that environment, particularly the Avalon variety that we selected. You may have a locally collected Peyton's from the marsh that may not perform quite as well in a drier environment, but it just so happens that our release of Avalon does. So we did a trial planting down in Ocean City, Maryland. They wanted to broaden their dune plantings out, and we recommended the Peyton's, and they're very happy with the performance of the Spartina Peyton's in the dunes in Ocean City, Maryland. Also, it's lower growing than the coastal panic grass, which had been spec'd by the Army Corps for the dune replenishment project in Ocean City, Maryland, which I'll show a picture of a seeding of that. But it's 3 to 4 feet tall, so obviously some property owners on the backside of the dunes didn't like the really tall vegetation, so they were looking for an alternative, and Peyton certainly is a good one. The stickless, again, here's just a picture of the stickless, very highly salt tolerant. It usually grows in areas where you have standing water, high salt environment, in with the Peyton's usually. The giant cordgrass, again, lower salt tolerance than the Peyton's and the alterniflora. So it grows in the fresh tidal creeks, as well as the freshwater cordgrass, the Spartina pectinata. And as a matter of fact, we actually have a Long Island genotype of pectinata that we have available for anybody who might be interested in growing it, if you're a grower. We've made it available to growers in Jersey that we deal with. This was originally selected by our Big Flats Plant Material Center up in New York. And I made the argument that since we service Long Island out of our Cape May Center, that I wanted to get that material, so they gave it to me. American 3 Square is another one that has a fairly good salt tolerance. It grows in that intertidal zone along with alterniflora. Not quite as highly salt tolerant as alterniflora is. It will grow in tidal fresh areas or brackish areas. This picture has a little bit of a story behind it. The plant growing there, the tall plant in the background here, is switchgrass. And this is actually a fresh tidal creek in the upper Chesapeake Bay, close to where the Susquehanna River empties into the upper Chesapeake Bay. This switchgrass was growing in the intertidal zone there, so we harvested seed off of it, did what we call a seed increase or a plant increase, and now we have it as a release that we call high tide germplasm. It's a switchgrass for shoreline environments. There are many varieties of switchgrass out there. Some are for 4-H, for livestock. Some are for dry site stabilization. This happens to be for shoreline sites. But the interesting thing about this is that we had some containerized material of this growing at our Plant Materials Center in the areas we were acclimating Spartina alterniflora for an Army Corps project. And so we were slowly adding salt up to about the 25 parts per thousand level. And we noticed by accident that these containers of this particular switchgrass, even though it was collected from a freshwater environment, had plenty of tolerance to 25 parts per thousand salt. Wow.
You only have 5 minutes.
Wow. All right. Anyway, we did some further testing on this and planted it in the Back Bay behind Stone Harbor in South Jersey, and found that it was very, very salt tolerant. So you can even take a plant like a switchgrass growing in a freshwater environment and realize that it has a fair amount of salt tolerance. So we've been encouraging folks to plant plugs of these native grasses, native warm season grasses like switchgrass and coastal panic grass, and incorporating them into their planting sites. One more comment I had about this was, I was called out by the Maryland RC&D folks, Vasquez group, the Maryland DNR and the RC&D, to look at some of these Upper Bay shoreline sites where they were typically planting alternate flora and patent. So it didn't matter what the salt concentration was of the tidal water, that they were just basically planting the same thing. And they noticed the alternate flora wasn't flourishing as well in the Upper Bay and in the freshwater environment. So that's when we started thinking about, hey, let's look at some alternatives. Let's look at planting switchgrass and coastal panic grass and American three square and Canada rush, and there were a few others that we incorporated into the planting plan. And I'm hoping that's still going on, Vasquez, where you're planting some other things other than Spartina patens and altiflora in those tidal freshwater areas. This is just a planting in a freshwater area around the dike, planted with switchgrass and coastal panic grass plugs. Here's coastal panic grass. It's closely related to switchgrass. It grows on the barrier islands. It's more predominant on the barrier islands in the dune system than switchgrass is. Switchgrass is more of a tidal marsh plant. But it's been the only plant we've successfully seeded into pure sand, into sand dunes, in the back dune areas. And when you just use a simple garden seeder, single row push garden seeder, the thing is, the key is you got to get the seed in the sand about 1.5 inches deep. If you don't get it 1.5 inches deep, it'll just die and it'll desiccate. The emerging cotyledon will just due to the heat of the sand will just die. But if you get the seed in deeply enough, it expends a lot of energy to get that initial top growth above the surface of the sand. But once it does, it starts growing pretty well. And this is what you would expect after about the first growing season. Then the second growing season will be about knee to thigh high, and then the third growing season will be about waist to chest high. So we're working on sort of broadening the plant palette we can seed into sand dunes or sandy areas on shorelines. Because like I said, this is the only one we've successfully seeded into those areas. Coastal blue stem is another option. There's the little blue stem, and then there's the coastal variant. It's Schizogrium littoralis. It's the coastal variant. It's a little bit different morphologically. It has high salt spray tolerance. Grows on back dune areas. Then, of course, we have our American beach grass, which you're all probably familiar with. I just wanted to use this as an example. The most common problem I see with beach grass plantings is the stems aren't planted deeply enough. These stems need to be in the ground about two-thirds of the length of the stem needs to be in the sand, in the soil. It's usually the other way around. You know, 2/3 is exposed and 1/3 is in the sand. It needs to be planted much deeper for survival. The other thing I wanted to mention about American beach grass is it's a pioneer plant on the dune. It yields to other species once the site becomes stable. It dominates out on that frontal dune area in interface with the beach where you have actively moving sand. It really thrives in that environment. You'll see in an aerial photo, which I didn't include here, it'll look much greener. It'll just be much more vigorous. It'll grow much more vigorously in that environment. Once you get into the back dune area, the sand becomes stable. There's other things that volunteer in. There's other things that grow in that environment. And so it's often considered, even on a slope that's you don't have actively moving sand. I consider it a nurse crop, so to speak, because it won't last forever, but it will create a microclimate for succession to take place. They've even used it out in West Virginia on old strip mine sites and old gob piles, old waste piles, where for 30 years nothing volunteered in, and then they went out and they planted a matrix of beach grass, and all of a sudden they started seeing the woody plants that were in the area that were dropping seed. All of a sudden those woody plants started to become established. It jump-started succession. They've also planted beach grass up in New Hampshire along the interstate highways. You have the granitic soils, which are very sandy. You have beach sand or sand blowing across the highway. They actually have a program where they plant beach grass along the highway. So it has multiple uses. Of course, seaside goldenrod, we have a germplasm release of this, meaning that we didn't do any selection on it, but we have a mid-Atlantic collection of, we call it monarch. It's a very prime food source or energy source for the migrating monarch butterflies, very important in our coastal dune ecosystem. Can I just, I know I'm running short on time, can I just mention the seeding trial that we're doing with the Army Corps of Engineers, because kind of breaking some new ground. This is in Jamaica Bay, not far from here, and we've been working cooperatively with the Army Corps of Engineers to propagate plants and develop some new technology for tidal marsh plantings and shoreline plantings. Typically, what's been done is planting plugs of Spartina alterniflora and patens and disticulus, and that can be rather costly as far as the cost of the plant materials as well as the cost of installation. So a few years ago we started a trial. Here's just another shot of planting a plug, season 1 versus season 2. It fills in very nicely. It does a great job of stabilization. It's great for a high energy site, but for lower energy sites we had some opportunities to do some seeding. This doesn't look like the state-of-the-art equipment here, but it's an old, what's called a planted junior. It's an old single row, like garden-style cedar. So one of our initial trials we did at Elders Point East, which was the first island in Jamaica Bay that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers. At the highest elevation, what we consider the low energy site, we seeded Spartina alterniflora. I think it was done in May, mid to late May. And again, the advantages of plugs are the quick stabilization, resistant to wildflower plucking, but the cost is kind of the downside. The advantages of seeding are that it's cheaper, it's more mechanized, you can cover more area in less time. So these low energy sites, we had a 70-foot wide buffer in front of it. So we had these large transplants. We also had plugs that were put in quart pots. And so our seeding was just to the left of this, so a little higher in elevation, a little more protected from the energy. But in one growing season, you can see how much growth was put on from the seeding itself. And basically, after 2 growing seasons, it pretty much equaled the density of a plug planting. So obviously, this is going to work everywhere. It's not going to work in a high organic soil. It's working on dredged sand very well. The high energy site didn't work quite as well. We did get some establishment in the high energy area, but after 2 seasons, well, this is after 1 season here. So we had some pockets where it did fairly well, but this whole area on Elders East Island was reshaped by the waves, and some of the sand was lost. Some of these plants were buried by sand accumulation. So the high energy site didn't work quite as well than the lower energy site is. But what we did find is the seeding is a viable option in lower energy environments, particularly in a coarse textured material like a sand or sand dredge material. We need to seed in a higher elevation, particularly if it's a higher energy site, and have a buffer, have a planted buffer, which will help establishment. The other component to this is having high quality of seed. The seed that we harvested in Jamaica Bay on National Park Service property, Gateway National Recreation Area, we took back to our facility in Cape May. We cleaned it like we clean switchgrass or any terrestrial warm season grass. We put it through an agricultural combine to eliminate a lot of the chaff in the stems and all, and then we actually put it through a series of clippers, which are screens that further clean the seed up and make sure you have good viable seed. So we started with really good quality seed for this project, and that's very critical if you're going to do a seeding. So based on our trial at Elders East, the Army Corps last year spec'd 32 acres of seeding on yellow bar. We worked with the contractor to help him get his equipment set up. This was more mechanized than my little single row garden cedar, my Planet Junior or my Earthway cedar. And I'm almost done, Jay. This is a shot of yellow bar in February this past winter, after the storm. It was obviously protected from rockaway, which was pretty much devastated by Sandy. But only 5 acres needed to be reseeded, or is planned to be reseeded, of 32 acres of this interior marsh area that was seeded with Spartina alterniflora. Around the fringe, of course, it's plugs. The higher energy sites, it's plugs, but on the interior, it's 32 acres of marsh being seeded. So there has been some seeding done in the Gulf, in Galveston Bay, on these huge mud flats. They would actually aerial apply the seed, or go out with an airboat and just surface apply the seed. And they've gotten some success doing that, but we're kind of breaking new ground, I think, in the Northeast here in working with this seeding technology. So that's kind of the thrust of our program right now, is trying to develop seeding techniques not only for shorelines but dunes and for other applications, because that's really the more cost-effective way to go in the long run. So I could talk for another hour.
Yeah, well, you're not going there. We all know about Long Island traffic, and you're going to get us in rush hour. So.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to be home at midnight.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris. That was a lot. I know.